In this Diablo 4 video, I'm going to be showing you my Fate Lancer build. This is a Diablo 4 Necromancer build that's aimed at World Tier 4 and is aimed for 70 plus characters. So just a quick recap on Blood Lance in case you didn't see the other videos. Blood Lance is a blood skill that throws at range and basically sticks into a target, and then each subsequent target you stick with Blood Lance, it deals damage to the original target hit and any other enemy that you hit subsequently. So you're sort of chaining enemies together, hitting a wider and wider range of enemies. You only have 3 seconds from the time that you hit the first target with Blood Lance for all the other targets that you hit to deal damage to that first target. So generally attack speed is quite important for a Blood Lance build because you need to get those Blood Lances into enemies quickly, and not only that, but the upgrade of Blood Lance we have now makes it so that you overpower on every 6th cast of Blood Lance. This is actually patched. In the last patch, this used to be every 8 casts, so this is a lot more often now, about 25% more often. And what's really great about attack speed is it allows you to get that overpower attack more quickly. So that's one way we're going to get a lot of overpowers with this build, but the other is the key passive Wrathfulness Vigor, and this was buffed in the last patch as well. You're now going to get an overpower, guaranteed overpower attack every 12 seconds that you remain healthy instead of every 15, so that's a nice boost there as well. So there are a couple things about overpower. Obviously this build has a huge focus on overpower because when you have all your enemies chained together and then you overpower, it overpowers all of them, and that's how you really get a lot of damage with this build. But overpower does not take advantage of your critical strike damage. It has a critical strike multiplier of 0% natively no matter what your critical strike is, and vulnerable damage does not seem to be applied to it, which means that critical strike damage and vulnerable damage is not particularly useful for when you overpower. However, you're not overpowering on every attack, so every attack that you do that's not an overpower will benefit from these things. So there is a balance here between crit damage, vulnerable, and overpower damage, and you kind of need to find that balance for yourself depending on what your gear is. Now, in an ideal world, you would have incredibly high attack speed, and you'd be overpowering constantly between what you get from Blood Lance and what you get from Wrathfulness Vigor. So you wouldn't really need to worry about vulnerable and crit damage, but if you don't have high attack speed and you don't have all the aspects for this build, then crit and vulnerable are going to play more of a role to kind of compensate until you can get that. So let's get into the offensive aspects first, and what I consider the most important aspect here, which is why we have it on our amulet, is the aspect of Hungry Blood. And what this does is it makes it so when Blood Lance hits an enemy that's already been lanced, it has up to a 30% chance to fire a Blood Lance on a nearby enemy. This would normally be 20%, but since it's on amulet, it's 30. This is really, really important because it's going to get you 1 out of every 3 casts, roughly. It's going to get you free lances into other enemies, which is going to spread damage around and deal increased damage to that original target, because more enemies that you hit, besides the target that was originally lanced, the more damage that enemy is going to take. And on my amulet here, I have Essence Cost Reduction, Blood Skill Damage, Ranks of Death's Reach. This is the passive that increases your damage to distant enemies. And I have Cooldown Reduction. This is almost a perfect amulet if I could judge one. Essence Cost Reduction is really, really important for this build. It's probably the most important one on your amulet because you need to reduce the cost of Blood Lance, because you just fling them so fast with this build, ideally, that you're going to tear through your essence. And if you don't reduce the cost of that Blood Lance even by like 3 or 4 or 5 amount of essence, you're really going to run out of essence quickly. And cooldown reduction is really nice for not only Corpse Tendrils, but also Blood Mist, and also Bone Prison. So on my ring here, on the first one, I have Aspect of Wrathfulness Chosen. What this does is it makes it so when your blood skills overpower, you gain up to a 50% attack speed bonus for 4 seconds. And this increases the speed at which you cast Corpse Explosion, and the speed at which you fling your Blood Lances. And again, this is really, really important because you need to get those lances into enemies quickly in order to deal the most possible damage to that original target. So if you throw your first lance into an elite and then all your lances into other enemies, or if they're grouped up and you're just piercing that first target and they're hitting targets behind it, it's going to ramp up your damage really quick, and being able to cast quickly is going to get you that extra overpower that you get every 6 casts. So on my ring here, I have Vulnerable Damage, Fortified Generation, Critical Strike Chance, and Maximum Life. Vulnerable damage, ideally, probably wouldn't be on this ring if you're talking about optimization, because you don't really want to focus on vulnerable damage for this build, but Fortified Generation is fantastic, because you deal more overpower damage when you're fortified, depending on how much fortify you have. Critical Chance is still good for this build, which I'll get into why in a second, and Maximum Life keeps you alive and also improves your overpower damage as well, so Maximum Life is really, really good here too. So on my second ring, I have the aspect of Potent Blood, and what this does is it gives you, while you're at full life, blood orbs give you extra essence, up to 20 essence. And what I find good about this is that you tend to be out of essence at the end of a battle, and then there's blood orbs everywhere, and you can just collect them up real quick, and that tops you off instead of having to sit there and spam corpse explosion. And obviously, while you're in combat too, moving around, you'll be able to gain essence that way. You could also use Aspect of the Umbral here if you have that, because you do quite a bit of CC with this build, so that is also a valuable option. Aspects you want to look for here are same as the ones I just mentioned. So on my offhand, I have the Aspect of Grasping Veins, and it's important to have a focus here because a shield will give you a defensive aspect, and you really need offensive aspects for this build. You literally, one of the reasons we don't use a two-handed weapon, besides the attack speed difference between two-handed and one-handed weapons for this build, is the fact that this allows us to apply even more aspects. And you so aspect hungry in terms of offensive aspects for this build. You need as many offensive aspects as you can get. And why the Aspect of Grasping Veins is so good for this build is it boosts your critical strike chance by up to 20% when you use Corpse Tendrils for 6 seconds. This is great to further boost your critical strike chance. And you might be wondering, like, why critical strike is good when I mentioned it's not particularly good for overpower attacks. Well, that's because you also gain up to 60% bonus critical strike damage to enemies damaged by Corpse Tendrils. And for whatever reason, the game actually adds this critical strike damage bonus to overpower. So when you overpower into enemies that are, damaged by your Corpse Tendrils, you're actually going to be able to get that extra crit damage boost. And this is a huge amount because this is just an overpowered crit. When you overpower crit, you get even more damage. So you're going to see huge numbers when you overpower crit into Corpse Tendrilled enemies. So this is very, very important for this build. You could consider putting it on your amulet. It's that important. Although I like Blood Lance, the aspect that makes extra Blood Lances a little bit better. But you definitely want both of these aspects. And then on my wand here, I have the Accelerating aspect. This makes it so that critical strikes with core skills, in this case Blood Lance, increase your attack speed by up to 25%. Again, attack speed is super important for this build, so getting all the attack speed we can get is super important. And honestly, I think a wand is fine for this, or a one-handed scythe. Scythe gives you a life on kill, which is really nice. Life on kill can help you really tank through a lot of enemies while you're just sitting there flinging blood lances and you just keep topping up your health. So either one of these is good. We do use some lucky hit mechanics, which I'll go into in a minute. So lucky hit isn't bad, but you can use either one of these. Whichever one you want is not particularly important. So talking about bonuses you want on the offhand for a second, cooldown reduction is good. This is going to make your Bone Prison come off cooldown faster. Corpse Tendrils, Blood Mist all come off that faster. Critical strike chance is good. In order to have that critical strike chance when you've used Corpse Tendrils, that's where you really want to be able to crit. So if you had 0% and you use Corpse Tendrils and now you have 20%, you're not very likely to crit. But if you have like 40% crit chance, you use Corpse Tendrils, and now you get 20% on top, you have a 60% way more likely to crit. Anything that gives you resource generation here, increased resource generation, or lucky hit to give resources is good here, as is life on kill, kind of in this case makes up for the fact that I don't have a one-handed sight. And on your weapon, you're definitely going to want overpower damage. Overpower damage is probably one of the main things you want to look for on this build. So you want overpower damage here. If you can get overpower damage on your rings too, that'd be great. Intelligence is super important. And then, you can get crit damage. You don't really need it. Or vulnerable damage. These are, good when you're not overpowering. But, damage to distant, damage to crowd control. Both of these are really good for this as well. Or damage to core skills. I do want to mention that you can use Black River for this build instead of like a custom wand. But yeah, I would take that accelerating aspect and put it on one of your rings or something like that in order to gain increased attack speed, maybe in place of the Potent Blood aspect. You might have a little bit of energy management issues if you do this, but because the Black River, detonates many corpses at the same time, that kind of compensates for that. And this can make Corpse Explosion factor a lot more into this build. So if you have Black River, you might want to consider using it if you don't have a good one-handed weapon. And this brings us to our last offensive slot, which is on our gloves. And here I'm using Fists of Fate. This is another unique item. This is actually the only unique item that I have in this build. You don't have to use it in this build. But let me explain why I use it in this build. First of all, it has 4 lucky hit procs on it. One of these heals you, one gives you primary resource gain. These are both good for this build because you need to stay at healthy or better to boost your damage and obviously stay alive. And resources is good for keeping you topped up. But you also have lucky hit to immobilize and lucky hit to daze. Dazed enemies can't attack you, and obviously immobilized enemies can't get to you. And damage versus crowd control applies to both of these, so that's really nice. But what's really great is the effect that these gloves have. They have it so that your attacks randomly deal 1 to up to 300% of your normal damage when you attack. And why that's great for this build, particularly if you have a high roll. I probably wouldn't use these gloves if you min rolled. But this makes it so that if you have like a max roll of about 300%, you're going to average, on average, about 150% of your normal damage. So that's, you know, above 100%, obviously. If you had 200%, you'd average 100%. I wouldn't recommend using these. I rolled 290%, so I'm using that here. But Blood Lance throws rapidly, which means that you're going to be all over the place. Some hits will be low, some hits will be higher. But because you cast so rapidly and you're not depending on like one big hit, you're going to come out ahead more often than not with these gloves. And when that triggers on an overpower, it's going to wipe out everything that's chained. And that's really, really strong when that happens. Now, another option for this is Frostburn. What I like about Frostburn is it's got crit strike chance, and its lucky hit triggers freezing on enemies. And you can chain this to many, many enemies, because when you hit enemies that are chained, it triggers damage on each enemy you chained before, giving you a lucky hit chance to freeze those enemies also. So that can be really, really strong. That can boost your damage against them, particularly using the control glyph, which we are in this build. So that's another really good option if you want to use a different unique. And then another option is using like custom gloves, putting the Bloodseeker's aspect on them, which increases your damage to the original target lance, the first target, by up to 25% for each additional target. So this ramps up the damage on the first target you cast into, which is really, really good for this build as well. And on custom gloves, you can get ranks to Blood Lance, you can get attack speed, you can get critical chance. All these things are great for a build. So you don't need a unique here, you can do this, and this is really strong also. So defensively, I'm using the Aspect of Protector on my helmet. This is to give me a damage shield when I face elites, pretty standard. Here I have Max Essence, Maximum Life. Again, more life is good for overpowered damage. Also keeps you alive. Total armor plus stats. All these are good for this build. And I've put rubies in all my armor in order to give me even more max life. Obviously, overpowered damage. If you could get cooldown on your reduction on here, besides, instead of like all stats or something, that would be even better to give you even more cooldown reduction. So on my chest, I have the Aspect of Explosive Mist. This makes it so Blood Mist triggers Corpse Explosion on surrounding corpses, which deals damage, gives you resources back via Grim Harvest, and also reduces the cooldown of Blood Mist, which is nice. Now this aspect is a lot better if you're using Black River, because you can detonate up to 5 corpses with each corpse explosion, dealing a lot more damage, also improving your resource gain, but it's still nice to have. On my armor, I've got max life, I've got blood skill damage, damage reduction while fortified, because we're fortified constantly, although, you know, damage reduction to close would also work fine, or some other damage reduction, and damage reduction to distant enemies. If you have a lot of damage reduction on your chest, you could probably use Temerity on your legs, the unique. But if you don't, like if it's spread between like damage and protection, you probably don't want to use Temerity because it doesn't have a lot of damage reduction on it. So on my legs, I have Aspect of Disobedience. This increases your armor for the damage that you deal, stacking up to 50%. This one's a little rough with this build because you don't spread damage around as much unless you're using like Black River and then use Corpse Explosion to hit like 10 things at once. But it's still good for protecting you. If you have mostly defensive stats on your chest, you could use Temerity here to give yourself a barrier from all the overhealing that you get. But on my legs here, I have Maximum Life. I have ranks to Corpse Explosion, which is good again if you're using Black River. But if you're not using Black River, you should consider having ranks to Corpse Blood Mist instead, because this will make Blood Mist have a faster cooldown. I also have damage reduction while fortified, because we fortified a lot, and damage reduction from distant enemies here. Again, as much damage reduction as you can get is good here too. And then on my boots, I have the Aspect of Shared Misery, which gives you, on lucky hit, when you hit a crowd-controlled enemy, there's up to a 50% chance to make another unaffected enemy also that crowd control. This is really, really good if you're using Frostburn on your gloves, because you'll just freeze everything when you have that going on, and it's really, really strong. And I initially was using Frostburn. I actually found Fists of Fate like just before I made this video, and I kind of switched over to it because I think it comes out better in the long run. But if you're using Frostburn, this is a really, really good one to have. As far as bonuses on your boots, you want movement speed and essence cost reduction. Those are the two most important ones. You want to be able to move quickly. You don't move very quickly as a Necromancer, so having movement speed is good. And essence cost reduction to get your Blood Lance down as far as possible is fantastic. So moving along to Paragon, on my first board, I have the Essence aspect, and this increases your critical strike damage as well as your critical strike damage to enemies that are not healthy. And again, if you don't have the ideal setup for this build, like if you don't have all the overpower damage, all the other aspects, tons of Paragon points like we do here, this is a good one to have early on, but you will probably replace this later. So for my first board, we've taken the Bloodbath board, and there are a couple reasons for that. First, there's some really good rare nodes here, and one of them is Powerhouse. This increases your damage while healthy and also increases your overpower damage and there are a lot of nodes around it that further boost your overpowered damage, so you really want to get this node and the clusters around it. Thick Hide is going to give you damage while fortified, which is great because you're going to be fortified constantly with this build, and also give you max life, which helps keep you alive and also boosts your overpowered damage. And Harden also gives you damage while fortified. And the glyph I have slotted here is Blood Drinker. Its bonus gives you a bonus to all magic nodes within range, which is okay. It's not very good for this build in my opinion. But what we're really after is the additional bonus, which makes it so Blood Orbs fortify you for 7% of your max life. When you have tons of max life, this is tons of fortify, and it helps you get up to fortified quickly. And when you're fortified, you deal more overpowered damage. And again, this build's all about overpowered damage. And you're also going to get increased damage for being fortified from all the nodes we have, etc. And you'll have damage reduction while fortified from your armor. So for my second board, I'm using Blood Begets Blood. And there are a few good rare nodes here. First is Invigorated. This gives you plus 20% damage for 8 seconds after picking up a Blood Orb. That's a long time after picking up a Blood Orb, and it also increases your damage while healthy. Aggression is also excellent for this build. Gives you 60% overpowered damage if you meet the bonus requirement, plus 10% damage, and it has a lot of extra overpowered damage nodes around it. So does the previous rare node as well. And for Glyph here, we're using Dominate. This increases your overpowered damage for each 5 willpower you have. This is huge for this build. You can get crazy amount of overpower damage from this glyph. And ideally, this would be on your second board if you don't have, more than one board yet. This is probably your most important glyph. But this is just a better spot for it than the previous board, which is why I have it here. It also makes it so when you overpower against an enemy, all damage you take from you is increased for 5 seconds. So you're going to deal more damage against enemies you overpower against as well. So this is really, really good. And you want to try and make sure you get as much willpower around this as possible to up your overpower damage as much as you can. And then lastly, we have the Bone Graft board, and mainly what we want this for is the rare node cluster around Reinvigorate, which gives you maximum essence and essence on kill. As long as the magic nodes around there give you essence on kill and maximum essence too. This is really, really good because when you kill enemies with Blood Lance, you can get basically like half the cost of your Blood Lance back if you manage to get some essence cost reduction, which is really, really strong. So you mainly want that on this board, but we've also taken the glyph socket here to have an extra glyph. And I've put the control glyph here mostly because the other 2 glyphs that I will get into in just a second that I want to slot here don't fit very well because they need willpower. But also if you're using Frostburn or if you're using Fists of Fate, you do crowd control enemies quite regularly. And also when you use Corpse Tendrils, they're crowd controlled. So this gives you a lot of extra damage when that's the case, which is fantastic. So 2 other glyphs that are really good for this build that I'll probably swap in are Imbiber and Undaunted. Imbiber makes it so that for every 5 willpower purchased, you have increased damage while healthy. You're constantly healthy with this build. This is over 80% health because you have so much healing and so much damage reduction. So this is just going to give you a flat upgrade to your damage while healthy. This is probably better than Control on average because you'll probably come out to be similar damage, but you won't have to worry if the enemy is controlled or not. So this is probably a good one to replace Control with. However, that board that it's on doesn't have a lot of willpower, so there is that to consider. You also gain 30% increased potion healing when using this glyph and meeting the bonus requirements. So that's really, really good too, because you potion sometimes and just getting extra healing from potions is nice. And the other option here is Undaunted, which increases your damage while fortified and gives you damage reduction while fortified if you meet the bonus requirement. You're fortified constantly with this build. We have so many passives that affect the way you gain Fortify, including one of the glyphs that gives you Fortify when you pick up a Blood Orb. So this is really, really strong with this build, and again, it's just because of the way the boards are that we've selected. Willpower is rough to select in any other board than the one that we have the Dominate glyph in, so Intelligence unfortunately kind of works better for the other ones at the moment. So that wraps up my Fate Lancer build. I hope I've showed you how this can work well. It's a ton of fun to play, and once you get it really set up and you kind of understand the mechanics of Overpower a bit more, you really start to figure out where you can get damage from, and it just plays really well. And there's options there, particularly if you like freezing. You can freeze enemies really regularly with this ability, which is really cool. Or if you get Fist of Fate, that's really fun to play around with. And even if not, you're just flinging, lances really, really fast, and it deals a ton of damage. Stay tuned for more Diablo 4 Tier 4 builds as we continue our 70+ build guides.